Welcome to the Stormsurf video surf forecast for the week starting Sunday, March 15th. Looking at significant sea heights, we see an area in the Gulf of Alaska generating maybe 20-foot seas, but mainly aimed up towards Alaska. Otherwise, seas generally below 18 feet, good only for wind swell, if it even survives the trip to the U.S. West Coast. Maybe a little bit better for Hawaii. Otherwise, trade wind generated wind swell south of the islands, and a tropical system pushing east, not expected to recurve to the north, bound for the Philippines or this general area, and not expected to reach typhoon status. First, we'll take a look at jet stream level winds. These winds up above 30,000 feet help support the formation of storms, and when those storms do form, help direct their track. Being how it's March, one would think that the jet stream would still have a significant influence over North Pacific storm generation, but that does not appear to be the case. Just the same, the jet is reasonably strong with 180 knot winds pushing over the dateline, basically pretty cohesive, running flat from Japan over the dateline to a point north of Hawaii, and then sort of splitting, but not really, falling into a bit of a trough, but there's no bottom in it, no winds in it, it's basically pinched off. Then the jet works its way up into Washington. A little bit of a trough, that is a dip in the jet, is trying to organize in this area, but just can't quite seem to do it. Let's put this into motion. As we move into Monday, winds drop off significantly, down to 140, 150 knots. A little bit more cohesiveness to the jet, but still no real solid trough developing. And that basic pattern continues into Tuesday. Notice a little bit more signs of a trough here by Tuesday, basically centered in the western Gulf. We roll that out, but notice all winds are also diminishing significantly. But the jet is supposed to make a little bit of headway into the U.S. West Coast, but still basically a split flow with weak high pressure in between. Again, by Wednesday, the trough tries to develop, but just doesn't quite get there. Looking a little bit better by Thursday. More troughiness. Again, the split point is sitting just right off the coast, about 130 west, so that's less than 600 miles off of central California. We need that split to push onshore for moisture to make it to the U.S. West Coast. Anyway, as we move into Friday or so, then there is some signs that the jet is starting to make some headway to the east. Still, winds rather anemic, not doing a whole lot to support gale formation, though there is a bit of a trough now in the Gulf of Alaska. And then finally, when we get into about Saturday or so, the jet tries to come on shore, but it's diffuse, weak. It's actually splitting over the dateline, but a new pocket of energy starts developing over Japan. Just nothing. I mean, there's a bit of a trough here, but just nothing that really suggests. Now there's a little bit better by Sunday, but still just nothing really suggesting strong storm formation or gale formation. Just weak winds, basically. A little bit better trying to get organized here over Japan. We'll just roll this on out to the 180-hour mark. Jet reconsolidates here in the west, kind of splits in the east, working its way onshore, but kind of anemic, so not a whole lot indicated at the jet stream level. Let's go look down at the surface. Currently, at the surface, here's our tropical system. This is the result of a strong westerly wind burst. In fact, you can actually see it here on the chart. Westerly winds, still 15 knots on the equator. These are not anomalies. These are actual westerly winds, 20 knots south of the equator, making it just sort of here right in what we call the Kelvin wave generation area. Otherwise, weak, diffuse, low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska. Fetch, there's a little pocket of 30-knot winds, but for the most part, nothing to really generate significant seas or anything of any real period. Put this into motion, tries to get organized. Now recall the upper level model, bits and fragments of a trough trying to organize, not a whole lot of wind associated with it. Here we go, broad low pressure, but just no energy behind it, kind of anemic. And it works its way, just basically sitting in the western Gulf, trying to ease east, weak low pressure off the U.S. West Coast, a little bit of north winds there, but not even really good for wind swell. Hawaii, nothing happening there either, weak trades at best. Roll this out. Things get a little bit more organized, supposedly, by Thursday. Here's 35-knot winds pushing to the east. And there finally we get, what is that, a 1,004 or a 1,000 millibar low. That's not even low in the slightest. If it were 968, then we'd be interested. But anyway, it kind of lumbers along there. 35-knot winds, good for some sea production, and another system behind it Roll this out into Saturday. A little bit better organized gale, theoretically, here in the Gulf of Alaska. And, you know, what's that, 30 knot, almost 40 knot winds, but not really. It just sort of all hangs there, which is nice, but there's just no real energy behind it. Another system, finally, on Monday, a week out, starts developing off the Kuril Islands. But again, given what we've seen in the jet stream, just not a whole lot there, really, to do much to help gale development either. So here we go. Let's see the effect of those winds on the ocean surface. As expected, not a whole lot going on. Broad area low pressure here, generating seas, little pocket of 20-foot seas, relative to Northern California, aimed kind of northeast and barely up the, what is that, about the 306 degree path. Maybe good for a little background swell at best for Northern California. And wind swell here relative to Hawaii, yeah, 347 degrees, maybe, but not a whole lot. Not super impressive. Anyway, roll this out. Not a whole lot happens. Low pressure tries to organize. Here's another little pulse maybe that's forecast on early Thursday morning. Nothing relative to Hawaii. Relative to Northern California, 302 degree. Not a whole lot there. It's tiny and gone quickly. Finally, come Friday, theoretically, what is that, 22-foot seas relative to Hawaii on about the 331 degree path. Relative to Northern California, about the 286 degree path. And it sort of continues east, peaks out right there. Relative to Hawaii, for the most part, that energy is all tracking perpendicular to the Great Circle paths into the islands. Sideband swell possible for the islands. And again, on about the 280 degree path to Northern California. And it continues east, almost getting reorganized a little bit there. That's at the 296 degree path, but none of this is really believable. The models have been kind of hyping this sort of stuff for a while, and it just never quite seems to organize, and that's it. So, more of a continued, somewhat anemic pattern for the Northern Pacific. And this is actually surprising, given what's going on in the West Pacific. We'll get into that in just a second. Relative to the South Pacific, now we were talking about strong west winds, westerly wind burst in the far West Pacific. That has generated both the tropical system here, Bevy, and then Super Typhoon Pam, which is currently not a super typhoon anymore, and falling south, poised to get ready to get caught in the South Pacific jet stream. This significant wave height charts, we're looking at it. Notice it tries to organize here, maybe on Monday or Tuesday, but most of that fetch is aimed south. We'll roll this back, maybe in the most optimistic of scenario, a little bit of fetch here, relative to Hawaii, about the 195, 198 degree path up into Hawaii, and relative to Southern California, about the 220 degree path or so, but not particularly well organized, tiny swell at best. And then that falls south, tries to reorganize yet again on Wednesday relative to Southern California. Now notice all this energy is going this way, not to the north. There's a little bit of energy here, so that's on about the 215 degree path to Southern California. And Northern California about the, what is that, about the 211, 212 degree path. Hawaii, about the 193 degree path. So yeah, it's a little bit more energy possible, and then the system fades out. And after that, it's all over. Nothing else of real interest occurring. It is the West Pacific, atmospherically, that is of the most interest. And so we'll look at the Southern Oscillation Index, difference in pressure between Darwin, Australia, and Tahiti. Negative numbers over a long period of time represent the active phase of the MJO, Madden-Julian Oscillation, which when it happens, helps support storm formation in the North Pacific during winter months. And then positive numbers are the inactive phase of the MJO, and positive numbers over a long period of time perhaps represent La Nina. Negative numbers, El Nino. Right now, daily average, nice little burst here, negative numbers, suggesting perhaps the active phase of the MJO is trying to get root, at least per this index. But the 30-day running average starting to fall down to minus 1.76, but it's been neutral. And the 90-day running average falling again now at minus 6. It was minus 8 for months and months, sort of popped up here a little bit too. This is about the peak of it right here early in March, and now it's starting to fall again. Graphically represented, the 30-day SOI average, you can see in 2013, numbers were quite high. Beginning of 2014, massive active phase of the MJO, massive westerly wind burst, massive drop in the Southern Oscillation Index. Then it rebounded, but then come July, it started hanging around negative, and here's that -8 average we saw. Now we've had a bit of a hiccup upwards, but there are things going on in the West Pacific that make us believe these numbers should be falling a lot more than they actually are. Current in the West Pacific, west wind anomalies. West wind anomalies, moderate to strong, and this has been going on for quite some time now, since early January, but they've really been strong the past week or so. Notice here you can actually see the tropical system in the northern hemisphere and tropical system in the southern hemisphere. This is not unusual. You get a strong westerly wind burst, it sets up cyclonic circulations on either side of the westerly wind burst. This is typically the sign of El Nino and happens normally, or at least it was thought to happen only during strong westerly wind bursts, and was perhaps a precursor to El Nino. Last year, the same sort of thing happened, and El Nino, yeah, we got a Modoki El Nino, but El Nino never really developed. Here we go, January, February, March again, exact same pattern setting up. Massive amounts of warm water we are expecting to be transported to the east in the form of a Kelvin wave. Anyway, so here we are, the Philippines, Australia, westerly winds in the Kelvin wave generation area generally bound between about 140 east and the dateline, actually out to 170. Westerly winds here, or westerly anomalies, and you get a Kelvin wave. Actual westerly winds, and you get a strong Kelvin wave. Off to the east, here's Mexico, Baja, Hawaii here, on the equator, and again, it's only a couple of degrees either side of the equator, basically a neutral wind pattern. A week out, still, westerly winds persist, not particularly strong, but this is interesting. Another cyclone is suggested in the vicinity of Tahiti. If that were to in fact happen, that would send the SOI dropping dramatically. It is the difference in pressure between Darwin, Australia, and Tahiti that caused the SOI to fall if there's low pressure or a big difference between them in the right direction. Anyway, westerly anomalies moderating and mostly south of the equator, still supportive of Kelvin wave development. And then continuing off to the east here, again, Hawaii, Mexico, sort of a neutral pattern, either a few degrees either side of the equator. But here's some more westerly anomalies right out in the dateline region. Going back in time, so we're looking at March 7th. Just a quick run. Here is the burst of westerly anomalies. You can see it here, March 8th, 9th. It looks like about on the 10th or the 11th it peaked out. Very solid looking on this chart. And this chart shows, here we go, actual wind directions. And notice real westerly winds. And we actually looked at some model data. We could pull up the quick scat data and some of the satellite data. We haven't done that yet. But the models were suggesting at one point up to near 30 knot westerly winds in this area. Most impressive indeed. Anyway, and the anomalies still, this was as of Saturday, still very strong westerly anomalies, warm water in this area. No doubt those westerly winds are taking this warm water and pushing it to depth, helping to form a Kelvin wave. And yet, one more way to look at historically what's been happening. This is the entire globe on one chart. The West Pacific is roughly here. The East Pacific roughly lines up around here. Kelvin wave generation area right between these. Going back in time, February 13th, there was actually westerly anomalies. Oh, the reds and oranges are westerly anomalies. The blues are easterly anomalies. There was a whole series of modest westerly anomalies the whole way through January into about mid-February. It died out, and then February 23rd, things really started to pick up, and then when we got into March 6th, things really started going off the hook. Very strong westerly anomalies. Continues to this point, the 15th, about one more day expected, maybe another little burst a day or two out, and then things start settling down. But this is a good long run. This is from January to February into March, a 2-month, probably the better part of 9-week long westerly wind burst. Most impressive indeed. These winds are the result of the active phase of the MJO. The Madden-Julian oscillation, depicted here in blue, that is, this is outgoing long-wave radiation. That is, blue suggests more cloud cover than normal, less sunlight reflectivity off the ocean surface. This represents the inactive phase of the MJO. high pressure and more sunlight reflection off the ocean surface. Anyway, the forecast goes for the next 5 days. Things basically stay in steady state, then little bit at a time, the active phase fades out while the inactive phase starts making headway into the West Pacific. This per the statistic model, and so that should get us to about the end of April, maybe a little bit beyond. The dynamic model showing much the same. Both the models now appear to be in sync. The active phase slowly fading out through the end of the month. Now the inactive phase in this one, notice here, it's supposed to be strong per the statistic model working its way to the west. This model is a little bit more encouraging, suggested the inactive phase fades out and just barely limps into the West Pacific. This would be the preferred option because during El Nino years, it is the active phase that is dominant. The inactive phase almost fades away. If it's a decent, solid El Nino, you see no inactive phase, and it's all about the active phase. Next, we look at upper level models. This is jet stream level models. The greens, propensity for precipitation. This, the purples, oranges, reds, dryness, lack of precipitation. So currently this suggests the active phase is working its way east and basically is going to be gone by the end of the month, the 30th, while a very strong, indeed strongest we've seen in long time, inactive phase builds in the West Pacific, works its way across the Pacific through the 14th of April or so. One would expect very little support for storm development during this time period. And then we get back into early April, and then the active phase comes on again, and a very strong one at that, working its way across the equatorial Pacific. So this model suggests that we're not in any sort of an El Nino pattern because you wouldn't see the inactive phase at all. It's a very robust MJO supportive pattern, alternating active, inactive, active phases. It's hard to tell whether this is believable or not, but it's something to look at. The idea is we would want to see this inactive phase not be nearly as strong as it's depicted in this model. And for the most part, this model has overhyped the inactive phases for the past year. We expect it will start to moderate as we move forward in time. Here we go. Sea surface temperature anomalies. Differences in normal for the ocean surface for this time of year at all these locations. Notice here, cool water working its way off of Peru. No, not a hint of warm water. If we were in a legitimate El Nino, you would see warm water all in this area. We don't see it. If anything, we see cool water. Not a good sign. Where we see the warm water is out here. This is a classic Modoki El Nino signature. The warm water is in the Central Pacific. You have cool water and an easterly flow in the East Pacific and in the far West Pacific. And this sort of cool pattern here and warm water all in here is very much a signature sign of the active phase of the PDO, or the positive sign of the PDO. We don't want to get into much about the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, but there is some thought that it is moving. It's typically a 30-year cycle, but we're only 15 years into the current inactive phase of the PDO, or the negative phase, but there is some solid data suggesting that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is moving towards a more active state. Certainly the large westerly wind burst and the giant drop in the SOI last year at this time was the first hints of it. It's doing it again this year. That would suggest that slowly the atmosphere is turning around from a pattern that would favor La Niñas for 15 years. The thought is that perhaps the atmosphere is turning around now and we'll go into a pattern of 15 years of favoring El Nino. Certainly, if the thoughts are true that there is heat buildup in the oceans, that the oceans are warming, there has to be a mechanism to vent that heat off. That's what hurricanes do. Cold fronts are the same sort of approach. El Nino is certainly that. There are ways for the planet to regulate heat and vent off heat, especially heat buildup in the oceans. So the PDO is yet a longer wave manifestation of that sort of process, a way to vent off heat. So if the oceans are in fact warming up, which all the data suggests that they are, it would not be surprising that we move into an active phase of the PDO and it attempts to cool the oceans off. We'll see what really happens. Again, the planet is a big boat. It takes a long time to turn. It doesn't turn on a dime. It might take 2 to 3 to 4 years to actually make the turn around, especially because the La Nina pattern has been so well entrenched the past 15 years, but it does appear that things are on the turn. Otherwise, for right now, we're in this sort of Madoki El Nino. El Nino, but not really, not in the right place, not as warm as it should be, but a sign that maybe we're trying to get out of the pattern that we've been in for years now. A Madoki El Nino is better than no El Nino. It's certainly better than La Nina. We'll see how this develops over the next coming month. Next, we look at subsurface temperature anomalies. Here's actual water temperatures, and we're looking down into the ocean. This is the West Pacific. This is the East Pacific. It is not so much the actual temperatures that matter. And notice these little X's. Those are actual anchored buoys across the equator in the Pacific with sensors down the buoy strings that measure temperature at depth. So this isn't all made-up data. This is very real data. It is the anomalies, differences from normal for this time of year at all these locations. Notice, plus 4-degree anomalies. Almost up to 5 degrees is suspected. This is what is known as a Kelvin wave. Westerly winds develop here in the West Pacific, push warm water at the surface to depth. That warm water makes it trek the whole way across the Pacific. It takes the better part of 3 months from the time the westerly winds start. So we had westerly winds starting in January, so that'd be February, March, April. You might see the first little ticklers of warm water starting to gurgle up here. This was generated more later in January. We figure it'll be May till this starts showing up. And the strong westerly wind anomalies that are occurring right now and have been for the past week, we expect that to yet push far more warm water in here, and you'll see yet another lobe or pocket developing in this area, maybe a couple weeks out. Anyway, that much warmer lobe would not arrive until probably the June time frame. Here's yet another model. It's a model. The other one was actual data. This is a model. This suggests 5-degree anomalies in the core here about south of Hawaii. Anyway, notice here's the cool water here. This is the upwelling phase of the Kelvin wave. Might be the suggestion of why there's cool water developing off the Galapagos and Peru right now. That's getting squeezed out of the pipe, and here comes the large area of warm water. Notice it goes from 155 east the whole way to almost the East Pacific now. A very large area of a lot of warm water headed our way. Satellite data from March 9th confirming that. This from the Jason 2 satellite. This is strip out all the waves, strip out all the tides, strip out any other sorts of anomalies, and this is actual deviations from normal in the height of the ocean surface. It is height anomalies, positive height anomalies that suggest heat at depth. That is, that heat, warm water at depth, water expands, pushes the ocean surface up there. And again, confirming just what we said before, from about 155 east to about 105 west, a large area of warm water in flight. And this is a great chart from NOAA. This is last year's massive Kelvin wave, the one that had everyone thinking we were moving towards the Super El Nino. This in the January, February, March time frame, working its way into the West Pacific. So this is the West Pacific. This is the East Pacific. This is water not only at, on the surface, but down to 300 meters. And here you can just see the trajectory or the travel path of this massive Kelvin wave. This was last year as it reached the equatorial East Pacific. Upwelling phase of the Kelvin wave after that in the June-July time frame, cooler waters. Then in the August time frame, a weaker Kelvin wave, followed by a second weaker Kelvin wave. And now here is our newly developing Kelvin wave, here the February-March time frame. Notice this one here last year was warmer. This one still in development. We would not be surprised to see more warm water building, perhaps temperatures in the, approaching last year's warm event. And then, of course, here's the upwelling Kelvin wave. So this is a very solid-looking Kelvin wave in flight. One can only hope that it might trip us further into El Nino, not for this winter, but for next winter. More to follow on that. And finally, the projection for sea surface temperature anomalies in the Nino 3.4 region. This is where normally you would find El Nino warmed waters present. Currently, those temperatures, per this model, about 0.6 degrees or so, and working their way up to about 1 degree in the May time frame, and steadily going up to maybe 1.5 degrees by November. That would certainly be a legitimate El Nino if it were to happen. But this model has been kind of all over the place and a bit on the optimistic side. Other models aren't nearly as optimistic, and there's about 20 other models. 20 is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but a good collection of other models, and they can all be bundled together, and you sort of get a rough idea of how everything shakes out. But this is NOAA's, and it's as good as any of the others, so we'll see. Anyway, this is an optimistic outlook. So to wrap things up, a little bit of gale activity trying to get going in the Gulf of Alaska, maybe more forecast by next week, perhaps a little bit of the jet trying to push onshore over California. Certainly nothing that would suggest a major weather event, but maybe a little bit of precipitation. Any bit helps. A little bit of surf possible. It's getting a bit late in the season, so one can't expect too much, but there is some hope there. And of course, the major event for this week, and has been for weeks now, is the major westerly wind burst occurring in the West Pacific, the development of yet another strong Kelvin wave in this January, February, March time frame, and its expected arrival in the May-June time frame in the East Pacific. All this potentially feeding development of El Nino, not for this year, but for next fall and next winter. Something to monitor. But for now, things are certainly on the upswing, not where we've been in years past. Much to look forward to. So if there's waves, go get them. In the meantime, we'll keep doing updates. See you next week. Same time, same channel. Thanks a lot again for watching.